The jungle smelled of rot and gunpowder. Rainwater collected in the bottom of the shallow pit that Private First Class Hideo Sakamoto called a foxhole, seeping into his threadbare boots until his toes were numb. His Arisaka Type 99 rifle, once the pride of the Imperial arsenal, lay across his knees. The bolt was stiff with rust, the bayonet dulled by too many uses as a cooking knife. He ran his hand along the cracked stock, knowing that if the Americans came, this weapon would have to serve him in one last stand. For 3 days his unit had eaten almost nothing but a handful of rice mixed with grass. Malaria shook his body so violently that he bit his tongue to stop the trembling. Around him, the jungle whispered with the sounds of insects, birds, and distant artillery. Each concussion reminded him that the enemy's supply lines stretched across the Pacific like an iron lifeline, while his own nations were threadbare and broken. He had been told by his officers that capture was worse than death, that surrender would bring shame not only to himself, but to his ancestors. Bushido demanded he die with honor, yet his body screamed for food and water more than for glory. The Americans were close now. He could hear them, boots squelching in the mud, metal clinking as canteens knocked against cartridge belts, voices raised in easy confidence. He knew they carried the semi-automatic M1 Garand, a weapon that could fire 8 rounds in the time it took him to chamber one. In training, officers had boasted that the Arisaka was indestructible, but indestructibility meant little against an enemy who could put a dozen bullets in the air before he worked his bolt once. A nearby comrade coughed blood into the mud, and Hideo realized they had already lost. Disease and starvation had accomplished what American bullets had not. He closed his eyes, imagining his sister Keiko in Tokyo, boiling millet with acorns because rice was already too scarce for common families. He wondered if she was hungrier than he was now. Then came the moment he feared. A shadow fell across the rim of his foxhole. Instead of a bayonet, it was a hand that reached down, rough, calloused, but steady. A Marine in a mud-stained uniform offered him a dented canteen. The metal gleamed in the dappled jungle light, stamped with letters he could barely read. U.S. Army, 1942. It was newer, shinier, more solid than anything he had ever been issued. Hideo hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. The water was cool, clean, endless compared to the muddy trickles of the jungle. He had been told surrender meant cruelty, humiliation, and pain. Yet the first taste of America came as water on a parched tongue. For the first time, Hideo wondered if capture was not an ending at all, but the beginning of a truth his nation had hidden from him. The first mouthful of water nearly choked him. It was too clean, too sudden for a body that had grown used to bitterness. Private First Class Hideo Sakamoto swallowed hard, then drank again, unable to stop himself. The American Marine who had handed him the canteen looked no different from the others. Mud-streaked uniform, sweat-stained helmet, rifle slung casually across his chest. Yet to Hideo, he seemed like a figure from another world, a world where water was plentiful enough to give away to an enemy. They marched him and a handful of other prisoners down a trail hacked through the jungle. His wrists were bound loosely with rope, nothing like the brutal restraint he had imagined. The Marines were relaxed, speaking in drawling English he barely understood, passing around cigarettes as if combat were just another kind of farm work. Their canteens clinked, their packs bulged with tins of meat and chocolate. Hideo's stomach cramped at the smell. He had not tasted such food since leaving his village. At the collection point, the scale of American logistics revealed itself. Dozens of prisoners sat under guard while trucks growled through the mud, unloading crates of supplies. The wooden boxes bore stenciled markings, U.S. Army rations, Type B. Soldiers stacked them casually, laughing as if the war were an inconvenience rather than a desperate struggle. Each crate held more food than his squad had eaten in weeks. It was not cruelty that broke him, but abundance. Sergeant James Callahan, the American guard assigned to watch the group, chewed gum and kept his M1 Garand balanced across his knees. He noticed Hideo staring at the rifle, its oiled stock gleaming even in the damp light. Callahan smiled faintly, as though he knew the thought forming in Hideo's mind. This was the weapon that had torn through Japanese ranks, a rifle that seemed to fire as fast as thought. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One man with a Garand could dominate a dozen with Arisakas. As the sun sank, a cook ladled steaming stew into tin mess kits for the Marines. Leftovers were offered to the prisoners without hesitation. Hideo hesitated, ashamed to accept, but hunger overpowered pride. The stew was thick with beef, potatoes, carrots, ingredients he had only seen at festival times in Japan. Every bite was both nourishment and humiliation, proof that the Americans could afford to feed their enemies better than Japan fed its soldiers. That night, lying on the damp ground, Hideo turned the borrowed canteen in his hands. The stamped year, 1942, burned into his memory. His homeland was already starving, yet the Americans were producing new gear by the millions, casually replacing what they lost. For the first time, Hideo sensed the scale of what he faced. Not just an enemy army, but a machine of industry that seemed limitless. The journey began under a sky crowded with iron. When the prisoners were marched onto the docks at Guadalcanal, Hideo froze at the sight before him. Stretching across the horizon were rows of Liberty ships, their gray hulls lined up like a steel forest rooted in the sea. Each vessel bore cranes and cargo nets, unloading supplies or taking on new loads. To his eyes, trained in scarcity, it looked like an impossible vision. America had paved the ocean with ships. They were herded up gangplanks onto a transport bound for the United States. The Navy guards barked orders, but not with cruelty. They carried sidearms polished to a shine, uniforms clean despite the humidity. Even their discipline spoke of confidence. Men who knew they had enough weapons, enough food, enough fuel to last 100 wars. Hideo glanced around at the other prisoners. Some bowed their heads in despair, others stared in awe. All understood the same truth. Japan could never match this. Life aboard ship was a strange limbo. The hold stank of oil and iron, yet meals came regularly. POWs were given bread so white it glowed under the dim lights, bowls of beans and meat that filled their stomachs. American sailors joked in the corridors, playing cards during off hours, always with a cigarette in hand. Hideo thought of Keiko, his sister in Tokyo, queuing for hours to buy millet cut with barley husks. The contrast grew sharper with every meal. On deck, he could see convoys stretching across the sea, cargo ships, escorts, tankers, all moving in practiced rhythm. A captured officer whispered the impossible numbers. American yards were launching Liberty ships in as little as 42 days, steel flowing faster than Japan could even mine ore. 1 year's output from a single U.S. shipyard exceeded the entire pre-war fleet of the Imperial Navy. The statistic hung in the salty air like a verdict. Captain Robert McCoy, already stateside, prepared Camp McCoy in Wisconsin for their arrival. He reviewed reports on the incoming prisoners, aware that numbers were small compared to the flood of Germans and Italians. Still, policy was policy. Humane treatment, Geneva Convention compliance, discipline with dignity. For him, the war was fought as much in perception as in firepower. When the transport finally docked, Hideo stepped onto American soil, bewildered. He had crossed from jungle ruin to industrial paradise in weeks. As trucks rumbled to carry them inland, he thought of the endless ships, the effortless abundance, the laughter of men who did not fear defeat. The sea crossing had shown him a truth no officer dared admit. America's factories had already decided the war. Snowflakes drifted down like silent ash when Hideo first set foot on the grounds of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The winter air cut into his lungs sharper than any bayonet. He had never seen snow before, never smelled pine so thick, never felt cold so absolute. The guards herded the prisoners through the gates, rifles slung casually across shoulders. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, smoke curling from chimneys, the smell of wood stoves promising warmth inside. Processing was brisk, almost mechanical. Their names were recorded, uniforms stripped, medical exams conducted with efficiency. An army doctor, sleeves rolled to his elbows, checked Hideo's temperature. listened to his lungs, and frowned at the sound of malaria rattling in his chest. Without hesitation, he scribbled a note and ordered quinine. Hideo blinked in disbelief. Medicine, real medicine, given freely to a prisoner? At home, his sister queued hours just to receive aspirin from overworked clinics. The first meal was served in the mess hall, and there the revelation struck deepest. Hideo shuffled forward, tin tray in hand, and a ladle clattered down stew, rich with beef, potatoes, and carrots. Beside it, a slice of white bread, soft as cloud, and a cup of milk so cold his teeth ached with the first swallow. He stared at the tray as though it were a trick. Back home, civilians lived on rations of millet and barley, their daily calories barely reaching 1,800. Here, the enemy handed him over 3,000 calories without hesitation. Around him, fellow POWs whispered in disbelief. One muttered that his own family in Osaka had not tasted meat in a year. Another clutched the bread as if it might vanish. No guards mocked them. No sneers accompanied the generosity. For the Americans, this was routine, feeding even the enemy with abundance. Captain Robert McCoy, overseeing operations, understood the significance. He knew the Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, but he also knew this was something greater. Every bowl of stew was a message. America had so much it could afford to feed those who had tried to kill its sons. He watched the prisoners eat and recognized in their eyes the dawning of realization. For Hideo, every bite was humiliation wrapped in kindness. The stew filled his stomach, but it emptied his pride. His officers had promised glory in starvation and victory through sacrifice. Yet here, in a foreign camp surrounded by snow, he found comfort his own homeland could not provide. As he scraped the last drop of stew from his tray, Hideo lifted his eyes to the falling snow outside. Each flake settled without sound, covering the earth in white, erasing footprints and foxholes alike. In that silence, he understood more than in any battle. Japan's empire could not match a nation that treated its prisoners better than its enemies treated their own citizens. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Sharp, acrid, tinged with sweetness, the smell of tobacco curling into the cold air. A guard leaned against the barracks wall, a Lucky Strike cigarette glowing between his fingers. He drew a long breath, exhaled slowly, then flicked the butt half-finished into the snow. Hideo stared. The discarded stub smoldered where it landed, wasting away to ash. In Tokyo, a single cigarette was worth a meal on the black market. Officers hoarded them, trading favors for even a puff. Men scavenged butts from the gutter, rolling leftover shreds into paper to steal one more drag. Yet here, an American had so much he could throw half a cigarette away without thought. The camp smelled of plenty. Coffee brewing in tin mugs, bread baking in ovens, smoke from fires rising with no fear of shortage. Guards carried ration packs bulging with tins, their belts hung with fresh cartridges, their canteens always full. For them, war seemed an inconvenience, not the life or death struggle Japan endured. Inside the barracks, whispers passed between prisoners. Some spoke of what they had seen in the jungle, American soldiers with pockets stuffed with chocolate, trucks groaning under crates of Spam, men casually wasting what Japanese troops would kill to protect. Others recalled stories from the Pacific Islands, enemy corpses with unopened ration tins still strapped to their packs, abandoned not from scarcity, but because they were too heavy to carry. Sergeant James Callahan walked the rows of bunks with his Garand slung over his shoulder, chewing gum. The rifle gleamed, its oiled parts perfect, its 8-round clip snapping home with practiced ease. Hideo thought of his own Arisaka, rusted, fragile, slow. The Americans had weapons to spare, ammunition flowing like rivers, while his homeland rationed bullets. That night, an older prisoner whispered a bitter truth. Their trash is worth more than our treasure. Hideo lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the faint laughter of guards outside. He thought of the cigarette stub burning in the snow, its smoke curling into the winter air, and knew it was a symbol. America could waste what Japan could not even provide. The realization hurt more than hunger. It was not cruelty, not punishment that defeated him. It was the casualness of abundance. When even waste became a weapon, the war was already lost. The smoke drifted upward, fading into the cold Wisconsin sky. To Hideo, it seemed to spell out a truth that no officer had dared to say aloud. The letter arrived folded twice, the paper thin as onion skin. Hideo unfolded it with trembling hands. The barracks around him hushed as other prisoners read their own mail. The words were simple, the handwriting familiar. "Brother, we are well," it began. But the ink wavered where his sister Keiko had pressed too hard, as though her brush had carried more weight than the paper could hold. She described mornings spent queuing in Tokyo for food rations, only to return with millet mixed with barley husks. Rice, once the heart of every meal, had become scarce, reserved for the military elite. Their neighbors boiled acorns to make a bitter paste. Mothers foraged for weeds along the roadside. Even when rations came, they amounted to little more than 1,800 calories a day, hardly enough to sustain labor. Her letter tried to hide despair, but the truth bled through. Hollow cheeks, hunger gnawing at families, the terror of sirens when American bombers passed overhead. Hideo folded the paper against his chest. He thought of the bowl of beef stew he had eaten that evening, the slice of white bread soft as a cloud. His stomach was full, his body warmer than it had been in months. He could not imagine writing Keiko that he lived on 3 meals a day, complete with milk and sugar, guarded by men who smoked cigarettes like incense offerings to waste. How could he tell her that he was healthier in captivity than she was in her own home? That night, the camp grew quiet except for the wind moving through pine branches. In the distance, an American guard laughed at a joke, his voice rising into the cold air. Hideo lay on his bunk, reading the letter again by the dim glow of a single bulb. He thought of Keiko, crouching in a bomb shelter, clutching the same hunger that had nearly killed him in the jungle. The next morning, he saw a new detail. On the mess line, soldiers handed out breakfast with mechanical ease: oatmeal, bread, a spoonful of jam. Behind the counter, a cook complained casually about having too much flour in storage. Too much. The word seared into Hideo's mind. His sister's letter spoke of starvation, and here the enemy grumbled of abundance. He tucked the letter into his jacket, near his heart. The ink carried the voice of home, but the food in his stomach carried a different message, one he could never confess to her. As he stepped outside into the snow, flakes landing on his lashes, Hideo realized with shame that he dreaded leaving America more than he dreaded staying prisoner. The earth smelled of loam and sunlight the day they marched the prisoners into the sugar beet fields. Rows stretched beyond the horizon, neat and endless, unlike the patchwork paddies of Hideo's home village. The soil crumbled in his hands, rich and dark, as though America itself grew stronger with every harvest. They were handed tools, shown the rows, and told to work. Guards watched from a distance, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. No shouting, no threats. Just labor, steady and rhythmic, under a sun that felt less hostile than the jungle. For every day's work, the prisoners earned 80 cents in camp scrip, tokens they could exchange for candy, toiletries, or extra cigarettes at the camp canteen. Hideo clutched his first payment with disbelief. Prisoners earning wages? The idea would have been laughable back in Japan, where soldiers and civilians alike were expected to sacrifice without reward. The work was hard, bending under the sun, hands blistering on the handles of hose. Yet the meals that followed astonished him. Lunch was thick sandwiches, apples crisp with juice, and coffee strong enough to bite the tongue. Every calorie burned in the field was replaced tenfold at the mess hall. He felt his body filling out again, muscles returning where malaria had hollowed him. Meanwhile, letters from home spoke of farmers in Japan, forced to surrender harvest to the military, families left with scraps, women and children bent double in rice paddies with no promise of payment. Hideo knew that while he worked for candy bars, his sister labored only for survival. The guards sometimes joined them in the fields, sleeves rolled up, joking with farmers who had petitioned for labor help. American civilians drove out in trucks to watch, handing out lemonade to guards and sometimes even to prisoners. Their ease cut deep. These people had so much they could treat enemy laborers like neighbors. One evening, back in the barracks, Hideo unwrapped a chocolate bar bought with his scrip. The sweet melted on his tongue, richer than anything he had tasted in years. Around him, other prisoners savored gum, soap, and small luxuries. Some whispered that they wished they could remain here forever, that going home meant only hunger and ruin. As he licked the last trace of chocolate from his fingers, Hideo thought of Keiko boiling millet by candlelight. The contrast was unbearable. Each bite of candy bought in captivity tasted like proof that surrender had been a kind of salvation. The notice board went up one morning near the mess hall, tacked to the wall by a corporal with a hammer and a smile. At first, Hideo thought it was a list of camp rules, but soon whispers rippled among the prisoners. The paper displayed numbers, American production statistics printed in bold type, plain for all to see. Aircraft, 96,000 in 1944. The figure was absurd. Japan had produced barely 28,000 in the same year, most of them light fighters cobbled together from dwindling supplies of aluminum. The Americans were building bombers in such numbers that their factories could have replaced Japan's entire air force every 3 months. Hideo stared at the number until his vision blurred. Below it, steel output, 80 million tons. His mind reeled. Japan's entire production, even at peak, barely reached 2 million. That meant American factories poured more steel in a single month than the empire could manage in a year. The comparison struck like a hammer blow, not through violence, but through mathematics. Other figures followed: tanks, rifles, trucks. Each line was another nail in Japan's coffin. A fellow prisoner muttered that one U.S. factory alone produced more jeeps in a year than Japan had trucks in its entire army. Another said that America's monthly gasoline consumption exceeded Japan's yearly oil imports. These were not rumors. They were official statistics, posted casually where even prisoners could see them. Captain Robert McCoy walked past the board later that day, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't pause to explain. He didn't need to. He understood the psychology. Prisoners who saw such numbers didn't require lectures about defeat. The truth was there in ink and arithmetic. America was a machine too vast to fight. That evening, Hideo lay awake in the barracks, replaying the numbers in his head. He remembered his officers' speeches about sacrifice and spirit overcoming material odds. He had believed them once, clutching his Arasaka in a jungle foxhole. But no human spirit could outmatch a factory that could stamp out rifles by the millions, ships by the dozens, bombers by the hour. The impossible statistic haunted him. 96,000 aircraft in 1 year. Japan had not produced that many planes in its entire history. As the lights dimmed, he realized the war had already ended long before Hiroshima. It ended when America proved it could outproduce an empire into irrelevance. It was a photograph that bridged the gap. Sergeant James Callahan pulled it from his breast pocket one evening while making rounds, showing it to a fellow guard. The image caught Hideo's eye: Callahan's wife and 2 children standing in front of a red barn in Wisconsin, smiling against a backdrop of cornfields. The sergeant noticed Hideo staring and, with a shrug, held it up for him to see. Hideo blinked. In the picture, the children clutched balloons, their faces round with health. Behind them, the barn looked sturdier than the houses in his village. It was a glimpse of a life untouched by war, a life that seemed impossible. Over the weeks, Callahan grew into more than a distant figure with a rifle. He passed out extra coffee some mornings, chatted through broken words and gestures, sometimes even joined in the beet fields to show prisoners the proper way to hoe a row. To him, it was routine courtesy. To the prisoners, it was bewildering. An enemy who laughed, shared, and treated them as men rather than cattle. This was not the brutality they had been told to expect. Inside the barracks, the prisoners debated what it meant. Some clung to Bushido, insisting such kindness was a trick, a mask before execution. Others admitted quietly that they preferred life here to the ruin waiting back home. A few even confessed they no longer feared the Americans. Fear had been replaced by a strange, reluctant respect. The Geneva Convention hung over it all, invisible yet undeniable. Red Cross parcels arrived with soap, books, and sometimes even musical instruments. The Americans organized baseball games, encouraging prisoners to watch. Every gesture carried the same message: abundance without fear. Hideo studied Callahan's Garand more closely one afternoon, noticing the way its parts clicked smoothly, the smell of oiled metal. He thought of his own Arisaka, rust stiff in the jungle. The Garand was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of a nation that could supply every soldier with excellence and still have enough to spare. One night, Callahan shared a cigarette with a fellow guard, then handed the stub absent-mindedly to Hideo. The Japanese prisoner accepted it, inhaled deeply, and felt warmth spread through his chest. The moment was small, unremarkable, but it carried a weight that training manuals and propaganda could not erase. The line between enemy and friend blurred in the smoke curling upward. Hideo knew he was still a prisoner, but for the first time, he felt something more dangerous than fear. He felt understanding. The train clattered across the Wisconsin plains, carrying Hideo and hundreds of other prisoners toward the coast. Outside the window, he saw fields of corn rolling in endless rows, silos rising like monuments of abundance. In the distance, locomotives thundered by, hauling freight cars heavy with steel and coal. Even in farewell, America flaunted its strength. Rails laid across a continent, trains running on time, engines fueled by resources Japan could no longer dream of. At the port, U.S. Navy vessels loomed like floating cities. The prisoners were marched aboard, their possessions minimal, but their bodies heavier than when they had first been captured. Many carried Red Cross blankets, soap, or the odd trinket bought with camp scrip. Hideo clutched his blanket tightly, not for warmth but for memory. It smelled faintly of detergent and order, a scent his homeland could no longer manufacture. The voyage back across the Pacific was calmer than the first. Guards were professional, meals regular, medical care steady. Some prisoners even played cards with sailors, laughter echoing across the decks at dusk. It was a strange kind of parting, enemies sharing jokes, men who had once tried to kill each other now leaning on railings, watching the horizon as equals. Hideo stood on deck one night, staring at the ocean that separated two worlds. He thought of the Liberty ships he had seen years earlier, mass-produced like toys. He thought of the statistics on the camp board. 96,000 aircraft, 80 million tons of steel. He realized now that the numbers had not just won the war, they had shaped his understanding of what nations could be. America was not just an enemy. It was an idea made manifest in steel, bread, and generosity. When the ship finally anchored off Yokohama in 1946, Hideo felt dread, not relief. He had lived with 3 meals a day, medical care, and the strange kindness of his captors. Now he was to return to a homeland he knew only through Keiko's letters, letters of hunger, fire, and ruin. As the gangplank lowered, he clutched his blanket tighter. It was not just fabric, it was proof of survival, a reminder of a paradox, that he had lived better as a prisoner of America than as a free man of Japan. The city smelled of ash. Smoke still curled from blackened beams months after the bombings. Whole neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by rubble and silence. Hideo walked slowly through the streets of Tokyo, clutching his bundle of belongings, searching for the familiar amidst the destruction. The skyline was jagged with chimneys and shattered roofs. His footsteps echoed where once markets had thrived. Keiko met him at the station, thinner than he remembered, her kimono hanging loose on her frame. Her eyes welled with tears as she embraced him, though her arms felt frail as reeds. "Brother," she whispered, "you've grown strong." He nearly laughed at the irony. In captivity, he had gained weight. At home, his sister had withered. That night, she served him a meager meal: barley porridge, a few pickled radishes, tea brewed weekly from reused leaves. Hideo forced himself to swallow, though his stomach recoiled. He thought of Camp McCoy: bread soft as clouds, meat stews thick with potatoes, chocolate melting on his tongue. Shame gripped him. How could he admit that life in an enemy's prison had been richer than life in the Empire's capital? Walking through the city the next morning, he saw children with hollow eyes begging for scraps. Families sifted through ruins for firewood. Men hauled debris with bare hands because trucks were rare, gasoline scarcer. The war had not just ended, it had hollowed Japan into something unrecognizable. The numbers whispered from memory returned: 80 million tons of American steel against 2 million in Japan. One American aircraft factory outproducing the entire Japanese aviation industry. Here, in the ashes, the math made sense. Spirit alone could not rebuild a house, feed a family, or win a war. At night, Hideo lay awake, listening to the silence of a city that once buzzed with life. He thought of Sergeant Callahan's photograph, the smiling children on the Wisconsin farm. Their barn alone had seemed sturdier than this broken neighborhood. He realized with a bitter clarity that America had not only defeated Japan, it had done so without exhausting itself. Its cities still stood, its children still played. His homeland was ash, America remained abundance. Decades later, Hideo sat on a park bench in Tokyo, his grandson beside him. The boy clutched a can of Coca-Cola, bought from a vending machine that glowed with neon light. Around them, the city hummed with traffic, skyscrapers rising where ruins once smoldered. The transformation was breathtaking, but to Hideo, the memory of ash never left. The child asked him once what it had been like to live through the war. Hideo hesitated, then spoke not of battles or glory, but of a camp in Wisconsin. He told of snow falling soft on pine branches, of bread so white it dazzled his eyes, of chocolate bars bought with labor tokens. He told of a guard who carried a rifle that never failed, and who shared a photograph of children who had never known hunger. His grandson listened wide-eyed. "But you were their prisoner," he said. "Yes," Hideo replied. "And yet I lived better there than at home." The boy laughed, thinking it a joke, but Hideo's gaze remained fixed on memory. He thought of the notice board, the impossible statistics: 96,000 planes in 1 year, steel by the tens of millions of tons. He thought of how America's factories had outproduced entire empires, how its democracy had turned workers and farmers into an unstoppable arsenal. He thought of how kindness, even in captivity, had undermined every lie he had been told. Post-war Japan had risen from ruin, rebuilt in part by American aid, its industry reborn in the shadow of American abundance. Hideo saw the irony clearly now. The enemy that had humbled his nation had also shaped its rebirth. The legacy of that abundance lingered in every vending machine, every skyscraper, every gleaming train that rushed across the islands. As the sun dipped behind glass towers, Hideo closed his eyes. He remembered the snow, the stew, the cigarette stub smoldering in the Wisconsin winter. Symbols of defeat, yes, but also of survival. "I realized then," he whispered more to himself than to the boy, "that in an American camp I had tasted the future." His grandson looked up, puzzled by the solemn tone, but Hideo only smiled faintly, watching the neon flicker against the night. He knew the truth could never be fully explained in words. It was a truth written in bread, steel, and snow.